You're listening to the podcast series Introducing the Tanakh with Brooke Lester. This episode is Documentary Hypothesis, Part B, the E-Source, and Developments After Wellhausen. In the first part of this episode, we looked at what warrants there are in the Pentateuch for some kind of documentary hypothesis. We also looked regarding Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis. We looked at the starting place of D, that is the core of Deuteronomy, and the priestly writer whose narrative voice and sources make up such a large part of the Pentateuchal material. Leaving us with what is sometimes called non-D and non-P, which for Wellhausen was the J-E narrative, which is overwhelmingly Yahwistic in voice, the J source, and that leaves us with yet the E documentary source, or the Elohist, to look at on this side. Before going on to talk about what's gone on, to tell you a little bit more about Wellhausen's hypothesis, especially the way he understood the history of the religion of the people Israel, and also what has happened regarding the documentary hypothesis since the time of Wellhausen. This remaining source, the E or Elohist source, is so named because it tends to use the name Elohim for God rather than Yahweh, as in the J source. And it also uses the name Horeb for the mountain of God rather than Sinai, as is the case in the J material. Whereas in the J material, God is represented often anthropomorphically and appears directly to the people Israel. In E, the presence of God is manifest proximately or in a mediated way through the agency of dreams, angels, or other messengers, and visions. God is present to the people in a mediated and transcendent way, whereas in J, God is right here, right now. In E, God is far away. In a fashion that is commensurable with this mediated way of representing God's presence, E emphasizes prophecy. Not prophecy such as we see it in the monarchical period, because the narrative is about the pre-monarchical period and therefore before the institution of prophecy as we see it in the monarchy. Nonetheless, the leadership of Abraham, of Jacob, of Joseph, of Moses is depicted in a way that is prophet-like. Their prophetic leadership is underscored. Similarly, in a way that is commensurate with this view of God as transcendent, as far away, is this emphasis on what is called the fear of God, the reverence or the fear of God. The E source betrays not, whereas this J source betrays a Judean perspective, the E source betrays a northern Israelite perspective, with a focus on northern locales such as Bethel. Right, that same Bethel, that for instance is going to be one of the sites where Jeroboam the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, will eventually set up his cult centers. So the Elohist source is preoccupied with northern locales like Bethel. Many of these emphases, as we've described them, are shared with such material as Hosea, our only northern prophet, the Elijah and Elisha traditions of First Kings, which also show preoccupation with northern locales and other of the characteristics that we hear ascribed to E, and also the book of Deuteronomy itself, for example, using the name Horeb for God and emphasizing covenant in the way that the Elohist source does. Many of the doublets mentioned, the narrative doublets, when we talked about the warrants in the Pentateuch for a documentary hypothesis, many of those doublets are between J and E. So So, for instance, Genesis 12 and 20 both tell the stories of the ancestress endangered. However, it is in 20 alone where God appears to the king of Egypt in a dream and telling him the mistake he has made. Whereas in Genesis 12, he only figures it out. So 20 shows that E reflex of God appearing through dreams, visions, and messengers, over against 12, which appears to come from the J source. Or similarly, in the story of God making a covenant with Abraham, in Genesis 12, God makes the covenant with Abraham and appears to him directly or speaks to him directly. And in Genesis 15, story where God makes a covenant with Abraham, God puts Abraham into a deep sleep and appears to him in a vision that he has while he's dreaming, looking more like the E source for that tradition of God having made a covenant with Abraham. And of course, as we've already said, in Genesis 17, the story of God making covenant with Abraham, that version of the story has characteristics that are distinctly priestly, as we described the periodization of history, the establishing of a covenant that is associated with a particular divine name and also with a particular sign. Wellhausen dated the E source to the 9th or 8th century in the northern kingdom of Israel. That is somewhat later than the Yahwistic source. The idea being that the E source was something of an answer to the J narrative, that for Wellhausen, just as the priestly source appeared to narrate history from the creation of the world to the brink of the entry of the people into the land, Wellhausen, and so the J material begins with the creation in Genesis 2, and Wellhausen assumed that the E material also began with the creation of the world, and paralleled J in every respect, so as to be an answer from the hand of the northern kingdom to the J source, saying, oh, well, here's the history of God's ways with the people Israel told from our northern perspective, with an interest in our northern locales, and emphasizing the ways that we here in the northern kingdom understand God as being transcendent, appearing in mediated ways, and so on. All this, although the E source, our first introduction to the E source, is in Genesis 15. Most would not find any E material prior to that. And as I said before, the E material is very fragmentary. It only amounts to a very small amount of this history, as we find it in the Pentateuchal historical narrative. So, having reviewed all of these, we can see how Wellhausen would have ordered his sources in history, despite the fact that, of course, in terms of method, in terms of understanding, his starting place was the D material, so easily isolated as the core of Deuteronomy, and the priestly material, so easily extracted, for the most part, from the first 4 books of the Bible in terms of its voice and its typical concerns. Although this D and P material was Wellhausen's methodological starting point, we can see that he would have placed the J material and the E material first in his history. And so, for Wellhausen, we begin in the 9th century with the Yahwistic narrative of the creation of the world and the history of God's ways with the people Israel, with its southern perspective and its interest in southern locales, and perhaps indirectly in its indirect association of the ancestral tales with the Davidic monarchy. And then in something of a rebuttal or a response to the Yahwistic narrative, you have the Elohist narrative, where the northerners get their say, where the northern kingdom of Israel tells its version of the history of God's ways with the people Israel, a way that is essentially parallel to that of the J source, but which reflects northern concerns, an interest in northern locales, such as Bethel, which emphasizes northern concerns, such as prophecy, for example, We might remember offhand that during the monarchical period of the northern kingdom of the people Israel, during the period of the divided kingdom, the southern kingdom would have a stable Davidic dynasty that lasts for centuries throughout the monarchical period. Whereas in the northern kingdom, you had a number of dynasties, none of which are able to last more than a few generations, suggesting that prophetic legitimation of kingship was in some ways especially prized in the northern kingdom. And so this interest in representing the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also Moses, for example, in terms of their prophetic leadership. And then finally, then later in the 7th century BCE, we have the D source, which is not working with J and E. It's not trying to revamp them or rework them in any way. But the D source is simply presenting a law code that reflects the concerns of Josiah's monarchy during the time that he is trying to centralize the cult in Jerusalem. That said, the historical narrative that the D source, the narrative frame that immediately surrounds the law code, retells through Moses' mouth a part of the history of the people Israel, and it is commensurate in many ways with that which we find in the first 4 books of the Bible, suggesting that D either knew of J.E., perhaps imagining that his work is coming on the heels of J.E. That is, you have the story of J.E., which brings the people to the brink of the entry into the land. And then D puts this speech in the mouth of Moses at that point of entry into the land, recapping that history from a very distinctive theological point of view. A theological point of view which scholars will call Deuteronomism. And then finally, only with the exile do we find the priestly contribution to the Pentateuch, that is, to the first 4 books of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The priestly writer betraying the experience of Babylonian exile, showing narratively, for example, with its tabernacle, that just as God was present in a mobile way with the people in the tabernacle, in the tent of meeting, during the time before the settlement in the land and the monarchy and the building of the temple, so is God present with the people in Babylonian exile after the destruction of the temple and the end of the monarchy and their exile from the land. At the same time, anticipating with his representation of the tabernacle a rebuilding of the temple in the time after the exile, once the people have returned to the land in the way that the priestly writer would want them to do. In this view, the concerns and perspective of the priestly writer can be associated in the exilic period with those of Ezekiel, certainly, who also imagines a rebuilding of the temple in a very specific way, but also with such folks as Ezra, Nehemiah, and the chronicler, all of whom envision a rebuilding of the temple in the Persian period with a limited and very specific family of priests put in charge of the temple and its cultus. This project legitimated prophetically, as we see, by such prophets as Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8. Once isolated, the details of these distinct Pentateuchal sources lend themselves to helping us see, to an ordering of the sources, a chronological ordering of the sources, at least relative to one another, as Wellhausen saw. So, for example, Wellhausen points out, rightly, that in the J.E. material, it is people worship Yahweh, people sacrifice specifically to Yahweh almost anywhere. There are multiple Yahweh sanctuaries. The ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just put them up all over the place. And this is not condemned or censured in any way by those texts. It's a normal part of Yahweh worship to be building sanctuaries in different cities and towns all over the land of Canaan. For the D source, by contrast, this is something that is prohibited and newly prohibited. The D source is commanding the centralization of the cult in Jerusalem. It's calling for it to happen right now. All those Yahweh shrines, like the kind put up by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the JE material, need to come down with their Asherah poles and their standing stones destroyed. Standing stones such as that put up by Jacob in Genesis 28:18 at Bethel, the place where a cult site will stand later, and over which standing stone he pours oil as part of his sacrifice to the god of Bethel. See also in this regard Genesis 31, verse 13, verse 45, and verse 51, as this pillar comes into play again during Jacob's dealings with Laban. So it makes sense to order to place the source D after the JE material in terms of the history of the people Israel. The JE material presupposing that it's just fine to have multiple Yahweh sanctuaries, the D source commanding that this come to an end. And then though you have also the P material, where centralization of worship in Jerusalem and the restriction of sacrifice only to the Jerusalem temple is simply presupposed. The priestly writer is able to write as if, well, we have always done it that way. What else would we do? It's simply natural and normal to restrict sacrifice to the Jerusalem temple, suggesting, of course, that the priestly material is coming after the D material, and long enough after the D material that the reforms of Josiah were not only successful, but but the results of which can be taken for granted by the priestly writer. This ordering of the sources, with JE first, and then D in the ninth to 8th centuries, D later in the 7th century, and the priestly writer last of all in the 6th century, has certainly stood the test of time. There are some aspects in which Wellhausen's understanding of the history of the religion of people Israel, against which he sets these sources, has not so well stood the test of time. On the one hand, certainly the JE material with its multiple Yahwistic sanctuaries represents a time where of agricultural festivals. It's primarily agricultural. Wellhausen sees in this material no professional clergy class, and that clergy income is not yet regulated. For Wellhausen, he sees this as a time of nature-oriented God worship with spontaneous sacrifice. People sacrifice to Yahweh spontaneously on the basis of their feelings, especially their joyous feelings about the agricultural cycle and its produce. For Wellhausen, then, D marks the rise of a clergy class of Levites and other priestly families, and the beginning of a regulation of clergy income. This regulation of clergy necessary in light of Josiah's reforms. And then the priestly material, where centralization of worship is presupposed, we find that sacrifice is strictly regulated by a carefully kept calendar, not by the agricultural cycle by which Wellhausen imagines Yahweh worship to be ordered in the JE period. In the priestly material, the Levites, who dominate in the D material, have become subordinate to another priestly class, the priests who trace their descent to Aaron, the Aaronide priests. These are the priests of the priestly writer, these Aaronide priests, who have succeeded in asserting their authority over the Levites of the D material. And the priestly benefits are more strictly regulated in the P material than they were in the D material. For Wellhausen, all of this marks a shift from what he sees as, again, originally JE, nature-oriented, joyous agricultural festivals with their spontaneous sacrifice. And he sees in the D material, and certainly getting down to the P material, a devolution of sorts. Wellhausen does not think highly of the priestly material in terms of its theology. For him, we track a movement from the authentic religion of the prophets and the prophetic period. Think of the 8th century prophets like Amos and Hosea and Isaiah of Jerusalem and Micah, and they are associated with the J.E. material that Wellhausen theologically approves of. By the time we get through the centralization of the cult and then finally down to the priestly writer, Wellhausen finds in the priestly writer what he sees as only an obsession with genealogies and calendars and ritual sacrifice and lists. For him, the priestly writer is something of the dead fossilized husk of authentic living religion. This, of course, is a reflection of Wellhausen's own historical context. A 19th century German liberal Protestant biblical theologian who sees in the authentic religion of the prophets, he sees something that he would like to associate with the urgent concern for social justice and the privileging of spontaneous forms of worship with which he associates his own church tradition. The priestly writers, by contrast, he associates first and foremost with the with the Pharisees and Sadducees as they are represented in the gospel narratives. As anachronistic as that is, the gospel narratives coming so far after, centuries after the priestly writer. And we can imagine further for Wellhausen that this priestly writer, as he understands it, as he sees it in his negative view, associated with the Roman Catholic Church of his day and with the Judaism of his day. That is, with these more liturgically oriented traditions as compared with his own. One understands even better the way that Wellhausen understood the history of the people Israel in this regard when you look at his idealist philosophy, kind of a Hegelian dialectic thing going on with Wellhausen, which imagines that religion evolves forward, moving ever upward to better, more authentic worship, from the polytheistic animism of the ancient past to the monotheistic ethical religion that he perceives in the prophets, especially as you get into 2nd Isaiah, and which ought to then move upward directly to what he understands as Christian freedom. The priestly writer, for him, with his negative view of the priestly writer, doesn't fit into this ever upward and onward evolutionary understanding of human religion, as Wellhausen expects to find it in the biblical sources. And so he can only see the priestly writer as a sort of falling away, a lapse from what ought to be a steadily climbing evolutionary movement from ancient polytheistic animism up to the liberal Protestant Christianity of his own time. What criticisms have been leveled at Wellhausen's hypothesis? Well, one set of criticisms mainly has to do with a theological or a religious response to the idea of Moses not having authored the Pentateuch, or the Pentateuch not having a single author. In this vein, some will reject, on principle, the treatment of the Bible treating the Bible according to the methods used in coming to understand other literature, such as Shakespeare or Homer or others. Nonetheless, it's important to remember that there are, in the Christian and Jewish traditions, there are many different views of inspiration, not one single authoritative understanding of inspiration. The documentary hypotheses are themselves produced by scholars of Christian and Jewish faith, including Julius Wellhausen. Similarly, some would reject the apparent tensions found within the Bible, as we described the narrative doublets and tensions among the material and so on. The church biblical theology, Christian biblical theology, has historically been very concerned to find unity in the Bible, and especially a theological unity in the Bible. Nonetheless, biblical theology has largely moved away from that emphasis. Insofar as it sees unity in the Bible, it tends to be a unity of plurality, so to speak. So, for instance, Brueggemann talks about testimony and counter-testimony, making the claim that the theological unity that we find in the Bible is the commitment to dispute, the Bible's preservation of disagreement and dispute among its sources and traditions. That here, if anywhere, we ought to be looking for a unity, so to speak, in the theologies of the biblical material. Some have raised doubts about the realia of redaction and composition in the ancient Near East. In Wellhausen's theory, there's a certain amount of editing and cutting and pasting of source material by later redactors. And some have, and when we look for this kind of activity elsewhere in the ancient Near East, we find that the evidence is sporadic and genuinely mixed in this regard. At the same time, it can also be pointed out that the exilic situation and the situation of the post-exile is something of a one-of-a-kind situation, sui generis, so to speak. That the rather unique situation of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and yet the survival of different and competing groups seeking to preserve and reorder that material is something that we don't find reproduced over and over again in the ancient Near East. And so there's little basis for comparison in that regard. The 3 minutes or so that remain to this episode are far too short to try to be thorough about what has happened with the documentary hypothesis since the time of Wellhausen, but a few highlights. P and D continue to enjoy widespread acceptance. But a big change has taken place with regard to our understanding of the priestly material. For Wellhausen, the priestly material was a source among other sources. He imagined that there was once a J source and an E source, which were edited together by a single person, probably after the fall of Samaria in 722. And for him, the P source was yet another source, a narrative source, along with the D material, that some later redactor, some post-exilic redactor, took JE in one hand, P in another hand, and D in yet another hand, and wove them all together. But Frank Moore Cross came along at some point and noted that, for example, the priestly material dominates the first 4 books of the Bible, that the Pentateuch as a whole begins with the priestly material and ends with the priestly material, and that not only is the Pentateuch as a whole ordered according to the priestly periodization of history, but the JE material of, for example, Genesis seems to have been worked over by the priestly writer in a number of identifiable ways. In short, Cross made the insight that the priestly writer seems to be the redactor of the Pentateuch, the editor of the Pentateuch, that among the sources that the priestly writer sat down with, besides his genealogies and calendars and lists and rituals and such, was JE itself, the JE narrative, which he worked over in his own image. Also attributed to Frank Moore Cross is the insight that that the Deuteronomistic history, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, seems to have undergone, not been made all at once, but been created in the 7th century BCE in Josiah's time, but then redacted in the exile and after the exile to account for and explain and integrate the exile experience. So too the narrative frame of Deuteronomy betrays such a 2-step process. With regard to J and E, the E material again is very fragmentary, and few would stake their lives on the idea that there's a long narrative source behind it. It may be only a partial redaction of J in light of northern experience, or a collection of miscellanea which are only related to one another by being northern. Either way, the stuff is definitely northern in character because of the characteristics described earlier. Characteristics shared, for example, with Hosea, our northern prophet, and with the Elijah and Elisha cycles, for example. J is still accepted by perhaps most scholars, and for good reasons, many of whom would still put it back in the 10th or 9th century with Wellhausen, but some of whom, such as John Van Seters, who would say that it depends in some ways on the Deuteronomistic history, and so would put it in the 7th century or later. And then there are those who see in the what we call the JE material simply a set of traditions, originally small and independent, that have come together like snowballs and then into larger snowballs and larger snowballs, eventually into some solid shape that is made use of and collected as a preamble to the D source, as a narrative preamble to the D source, This is before, of course, P comes along. The D source would have been doing this in the 7th century, somewhat on analogy with the way the Deuteronomistic historian is using sources to create the Deuteronomistic history. The idea is that D would be using a collection of traditions, some written, some oral, as a preamble to his D source, and that stuff would have been what we know as JE. I'm thinking here especially of folks like Rolf Rentdorf and his peers. Well, this already puts me a few seconds past the 30 minutes that I like to limit these to, so I'll simply say thank you for listening to Documentary Hypothesis, and say if you enjoyed this episode or learned from it, I hope that you will listen to other episodes in the series introducing the Tanakh.